welcome to another session of AP Human Geography with Mr. Elrod. Hope everyone had a good week as we're looking at another week in review. This week was all about development and development numbers. So this week we were focusing, within the idea of development, we were focusing specifically on certain numbers that we could look at in order to understand the concept of development. So last week we were talking about the Human Development Index and the different statistics that the United Nations is going to use in order to understand this concept of development. Now, within the textbook, there's some number changes and some differences from what the United Nations is actually using today, at least in the textbook that we're using. So if you look at the United Nations, the numbers that they're using are the average years of, or the mean years of education. They're looking at the expected years of education. They look at GNI per capita, and then they are going to be looking at life expectancy. So you'll notice that those are very broad categories and very broad numbers that are going to speak to the whole of society that's happening within a country, and they're going to capture several different elements of a country and what exactly is going on in that country. So you have the social development numbers, which are going to be the life expectancy. You have the education numbers, which is going to deal with the mean years of education, and the expected years of education, and then the economic numbers, which is the GNI per capita. And so that's one way to understand development. Of course, that's what the United Nations uses. But the other thing that we looked at this week was there are a lot of other numbers that we can look at in order to discuss and understand development. So one of the things that we did is we created a chart and we categorized countries based upon whether they were well-developed or developed countries, developing countries, or less developed countries. And the way we based that was on Human Development Index. The United Nations actually divides nations in the world into 4 different categories. They have very high human development, they have high human development, medium, and then low human development. And so we broke those up into 3 categories, and students then went in and they looked at the various statistics in order to understand what's going on with that society, so we could get a better understanding of, even though those numbers are what the United Nations might use, there are other numbers that you could look at. We looked at things like age structure. We looked at the different types of jobs that people have, so GDP by sector. You could look at, of course, the GDP per capita to understand that. Now, one thing that's important to remember, and you'll probably get into this hopefully when you get into your population unit, is that death rates today are really not going to be a very good number to look at in order to understand level of development. The problem with death rates is that you really have kind of elevated numbers in both developed countries as well as less developed countries. And so you really just have to look at who it is that is dying within those countries. So in the less developed countries, it's going to be the young people, the children, and then in the developed countries, it's going to be the elderly because of the way that their populations are skewed. And so you probably haven't gotten to population pyramids, but hopefully that's something that you'll be addressing with your class within the next month or so, or the next couple of months. Some other statistics that we looked at least some indices and things like that. We looked at the Gender Inequality Index that also is developed by the United Nations. And so if we look at the Gender Inequality Index, what that shows is some statistics that are going to be more related specifically to women, and some different indicators that we can look at to understand a woman's position in society. So some of the statistics, and this isn't an exhaustive list of all of them, but you look at things like the maternal mortality rates, you look at the share of seats of parliament for women, you also look at things like labor participation rates that are going to be split up between the men and the women. So again, the idea there is you're looking a little bit more closely at some statistics that are going to be that are going to impact women greater. The other indice that we looked at was called the Gender Development Index. So what the Gender Development Index does is it takes the Human Development Index and then it breaks it down more specifically along the lines of men and women. And so today a lot of people like to talk about various gaps. You talk about the development gap, you talk about the gender gap, you talk about pay gaps. So there's all kinds of gaps that people like to refer to. So that's what they do, is you split these up between men and women. You'll see how the difference between the men are doing versus how the women are doing. Because if you take the number as a whole, sometimes the number can be misleading because the men might be doing very well, whereas the women maybe aren't doing quite as well. And then lastly this week what we did is we took some time to look at Hans Rosling's website Gapminder, and we looked at the idea of human well-being and some of the things that were going to impact women as it relates to development. So we looked at the importance of things like a growing GDP per capita, as well as growing literacy rates, to help improve women's position in society, specifically looking at things like maternal mortality rates and children per woman. And we looked at how those statistics correlated and, again, discussed kind of the significance of the GDP per capita and the literacy rates on the position of women within society, and how if we improve those things, typically what we see around the world is the position of women improving in society, which is then indicated to us a lot of times through things like maternal mortality rates as well as the number of children per woman. So anyway, that was our conversation this week. Again, all about development and development statistics. So that was just a brief review. Certainly, I hope you found that helpful. If you have any questions or comments, just leave those on the channel or shoot me an email. And so thank you for watching. And as always, I hope to see you next time.